Hey class, ready for the next project, the composition project? The first thing that I want you to do is to head over to mrsakura.blogspot.com, click on Photo 1 Projects, and look for the composition project, which is right down here. Click on that, and you will see the basics and overview of this project. Now, as is the case with all other projects before it, I want you to carry on what you learned from the last project into this project. So at this point, you should be utilizing perspective, lighting, and now composition, kind of bringing it all together, okay? And we've talked about some of these things throughout the class, but I want to go a little bit more into that today. So you're going to be taking 4 pictures, and here is a little handout that shows the 4 pictures. We have rule of thirds is one of the photos you're going to be turning in, leading lines, symmetry, and emphasis or strong focal point, okay? And let's look a little bit closer at each of these. So as I've said before, rule of thirds is when you divide your picture into 3s vertically and horizontally. And then you place your focal point in those corners of the intersecting points, okay? So it should be in the top left corner, top right corner, bottom, right, so forth. So here you have the person's head as the focal point, lines right up with those lines and that intersecting element, okay? This does relate somewhat to the golden ratio, which is another really great compositional technique that we'll talk about in the future, about how the curve of this line moves throughout the composition and swirls into this area. It's a repeating curve, right, that keeps repeating into itself. And of course, you end up with about a rule of thirds focal point if you follow that curve, okay? But this also suggests that you should put other important elements along these lines as well. Leading lines that we talked about are lines that come in from the corners leading in to your piece, right? They don't have to be in the corners, but just that they're on an angle going in, all right? So see here, this line up here, and this one doesn't come out of this corner, even though this line does. But up here, this would still be considered a leading line. These lines here are still leading lines because they're coming in on an angle. They're not flat. If they were straight horizontal or straight vertical, they would not be considered leading lines. In fact, those lead us out of a picture. So leading lines, finding really dramatic, intense lines that lead into a picture. Leading lines are even stronger when they hit a focal point. So maybe you could try that a little bit with your work as well, looking for opportunities to find leading lines that lead to a focal point. The next is symmetry, balance, right? Same thing on the right side as it is on the left side. And you should be able to take a line and draw right through the middle of it and have pretty much the same thing on both sides. Balance is very strong. It can add a lot of strength to an image, okay? In this case, we have another compositional element happening that we'll talk about in the future of framing, and frame within a frame. And framing is a really strong compositional technique as well that I highly suggest you learn to utilize. So framing is like, the fact that the doors here are acting as a second frame and there's a person in the middle. But notice the symmetry about how the doors are perfect. This person is perfectly in the middle, right? Same on the left as it is on the right. It's not identical because we have different people standing on this side than we do on this side, but you get the point, right? It's close enough, and it's playing on a sense of balance, on a sense of symmetry to add strength to it. This photo, same thing, although we also have some repetition going, right? A repeating element of the fingers and nails, but human faces are symmetrical, so they make a good subject matter for symmetry. And again, you divide a line right through the middle, break it into 2s. It's the same on one side as it is on the other. Lastly, I want you to take a picture with a really strong focal point, right? Now, this first picture over here utilizes a number of these compositional techniques we just talked about, pretty much everything except for symmetry, right? Human faces tend to be the strongest focal points in a picture, and the eyes are the most intense focal point beyond that. So having an eye as a focal point is a really strong emphasis. But notice how it also uses rule of thirds. It also uses framing because we have more light in this area that's kind of framed by repeating element of lines that all act as leading lines that lead into our focal point. So leading lines, contrast, framing, these are all ways to create stronger focal points. This is an example of pattern interruption, which is also something that we'll talk about later into the class, where you have a repeating element, such as these dots, and it's interrupted by a strong focal point. This yellow umbrella really stands out, and it interrupts that pattern. And when you have something that interrupts a pattern, it creates a really dynamic use of space and adds to the focal point. This photo here has some other elements going on again, right? We have rule of thirds. We have a frame within a frame. We have white around black, so we have a lot of contrast. So all of those things are drawing us into this focal point to create a very strong focal point, right? And then lastly, we have the bike is circle around the sun in the background, creates an emphasis of color. The circle is a strong focal point. It kind of looks like an eye, right? So circles are stronger focal points than squares or any other shape, but we're also drawn in there because of color and contrast. And again, it's pretty close to being rule of thirds, right? So if you scroll below here, you'll see a really great video that we'll watch in class. You can watch the whole thing if you want. I love these videos about cinema and composition in this case. Here are some student examples, right? So you have a student and they labeled their pictures well. It says strong focal point. You have the hand contrasted on this background, right? We have this one that's turned sideways, but it's a leading lines photograph. You'll see symmetry right here with this photograph, same on the left as it is on the right. Rule of thirds with the focal point being in the bottom left corner. Moving down, you see symmetry where it's the same on the left side as it is on the right side. Really love the simplicity and the strength and balance of this photograph. The textures and hues are really wonderful. Rule of thirds, right? Strong focal point, right? But there's also framing happening, and they used color to emphasize the focal point of the person, right? Close up, this is a good example of like close up eye, but it is a rule of thirds, or maybe it's their strong focal point. Rule of thirds here, we have the person is up in the top left corner, right? It's also very dynamic and utilizing great perspective. Notice how this one also uses close up, right? This one uses a bird's eye view. There's more examples, leading lines, drawing us into this person. Strong focal point, there's some framing going on. Rule of thirds, right? Rule of thirds again. Strong focal point, look at the eye and how it's framed in that locker. Color is bringing into it contrast, right? Rule of thirds, symmetry, framing again with the door. I think this is probably their rule of thirds. Submission, right? And you just see other examples. This one's obviously playing on symmetry. They even added emphasis to that, okay? So let's just look at a couple other examples. Right here, you see this could be turned in for leading line. It could be turned in for rule of thirds. It could be turned in for strong focal point. You'll have to make that decision. With this one here, again, kind of a similar situation where we have leading lines, we have a strong focal point, and we also have rule of thirds. It's utilizing all of those compositional techniques in one. And here's another example of kind of dividing a picture, although this is an even division, but you have your, kind of this is the area that would stand out the most. Golden ratio playing in right here with this kind of coming in, and it kind of shows you how you want things to kind of fall along these lines that are also within the image, but we'll get into that later. This is just, again, thinking about how using space and dividing up lines. This would be a good example of rule of thirds. And, tons. Even so, rule of thirds also involves having just something strong along the line of the division, right? So this would be moving along that rule of thirds line really well. Here's another example where you have a bunch of different opportunities where you kind of have that leading line coming in. You have a rule of thirds here, right? Good use of space. Again, here's another example of that rule of thirds. Right? This is a good example of pattern interruption where you have all this repeating element and then the nuns in the white interrupting that pattern. Strong focal point, pattern interruption again, right? Seeing how contrast can create really strong focal points as well as using rule of thirds. So, these are just some more examples. that you can use. Again, framing is one I really love where you frame the focal point. That'll really draw us into that. So just some ideas. You're going to be turning in 4 pictures. You have 2 weeks to complete the project. 1 picture will be due after 1 week that we'll kind of like have an opportunity to look at, talk about, see how everybody's doing. And then I will see you soon. Cheers.